and hopefully late participants will catch up later. So welcome to this 6th webinar as part of our project, multisectoral social dialogue project on the prevention of third-party violence and harassment. Today's webinar is a bit special compared to the other meetings, is that what we would like to do with you today is a brainstorm on what is really the core of the project, which is to have a look at the guidelines, and more than a look, but discuss and see whether the guidelines need a bit of a refreshing, an upgrade in terms of content, but also possibly in terms of its legal nature. So what we would like to do, and you will have seen on the agenda, is that it's also the first time we are going to do this, is that we will be in plenary, so together with the employers and the trade unions, until up to 10 o'clock. And then we will split into 2 groups, the trade union group and the employers group. And the employers, you should have received another link to split. I'm not sure actually whether, I think you will have to disconnect and connect again. Yeah, that's correct. So please make sure that you do have that other link to have your own discussion. And then we will come back together in plenary, and we will hear the report of each group. And then we will have a discussion on seeing whether there are common grounds, and I do hope there will be common grounds, and start basically mapping out what that common ground could be. And the next meeting then will be the conference, the final project conference on the 25th of November, hopefully in Madrid, but I will keep you posted on that. So yeah, just sorry I didn't mention the languages. So you have interpretation at the bottom of your screen so English, French, Spanish, Hungarian, and Italian. And I'm pleased today to be chairing this brainstorm jointly with Gregory from Ethno, the Telecoms Employers Group. And I also understand with another representative of the Employers Group, EUPAE Spain, which is basically the Employers Group for central government administrations. So Gregory, I saw your name, and I'm not sure whether that will be Nieves or Gador.
It's me.
Okay, encantada, Gador. Okay, that's good. So you have 3 chairs today.
Yes.
Right, so I'm also pleased, although as I said, there are a few participants missing, but there should be 18 EU countries represented today. And perhaps, I mean, we try to have a balanced participation in our meetings, but this time there is a larger group of trade union reps, but that should not have a bearing then on the outcome of the discussions and the willingness to try and find common ground. So I'm just going to recap if there are a couple of, few new delegates attending today's meeting, but this webinar is part of quite an ambitious, broad project with 9 sectoral social partners. So for healthcare, for local and regional government, central and government administration, education, transport, and telecoms. And really the objective of this project amid what we could see was an increasing reporting of violence, not least third-party violence at work. And in view of this increasing reports, we decided, as it also coincided with the 10th year anniversary of the guidelines in 2010, to go back to the issue and examine and discuss the scale, the impact, the reasons for third-party violence and harassment, And as you would know, this project consists of a research and in-depth interviews carried out by Jane Pillinger, who will speak in a couple of minutes. So the focus of the research is on subsectors. We try to break down the different sectors represented in this project. So to remind you that it will look at secondary schools, hospitals, prison services, for which I must say we've received many responses to the survey. Administrative functions there is a sort of background noise. I don't know if you can all switch off your mic, please. There's a kind of breathing in the background. If you can please turn off your mic, that would be great. Yeah, that's much better, thank you. No, it's starting again. Okay, so as I said, I mean, the survey, so we got many responses from the prison services. The survey also includes administrative functions in local and regional governments, urban public transport, and telecoms. So the first objective is really to map out what the situation is. But the second objective is then to examine the implementation at national level of the 2010 guidelines, multisectoral guidelines. And as I mentioned, whether they need some improvements, both in terms of content and its legal nature. And that's the subject of today. And I thought perhaps to remind you that the guidelines initially, so 12 years ago, were to complement the cross-sectoral agreement on violence and harassment, which were adopted in 2007, which does mention third-party violence, but it leaves it to social partners at the national level whether or not to include it in their national implementation. So that's very much the reason why with a group of sectoral social partners decided to go deeper into the issue of third-party violence and harassment. However, they are guidelines, they are not an agreement. So the legal nature is different in that they can be binding insofar as social partners at national level make it binding, but then because this is not an agreement, they would also have to be transformed into an agreement at national level. And as we will see in a moment with Jane, well, there are very, very few examples. Well, at least there's actually only one or perhaps a couple of social partners who have implemented the guidelines as a collective agreement. And in fact, and Jane, you will correct me, there are no examples of implementation across different sectors. So the guidelines were probably extremely useful when they were negotiated in raising awareness, trying to find solutions. And then we also did a report of their implementation a couple of years later. But in terms of formal implementation as a national multisectoral agreement, this has not happened. So we will want also to discuss that part of the implementation and what we can do to improve the implementation. It's just to recap also that the guidelines are quite practical, and by definition, they should really aim to support actions by employers and the trade unions to prevent, reduce, and tackle, mitigate third-party violence. And one key element is to encourage employers to establish a clear policy framework for the prevention and management of third-party violence and harassment. And indeed, the guidelines also state, and that was again 12 years ago, that the most successful initiatives involve both social partners, trade unions and management, right from the start, and to make sure that this joint approach covers different aspects from awareness raising, prevention, training, to also methodology on how to report and support victims of third-party violence and harassment, and make sure, obviously, that they can also keep their job. As we know, there are quite a few examples. Once you've been subject to harassment or third-party violence, it is sometimes quite tough to actually keep your job. Now, so that's what the guidelines are about. And we had 5 previous webinars when we discussed gender-based violence, which will be which has been and will continue to be quite central to our discussions, not least in light of the ILO Convention 190 and related recommendation. We also discussed, and that was perhaps also part of the updating elements to the guidelines, digitalization and the growing impact of cyber violence, which, to remind you, would impact much more young women at work. And also the extent to which digitalization can help prevent some forms of violence and at the same time perhaps create new ones. And then at the last webinar, we also discussed compensation, reparations for victims of violence. And again, we had a summary of the already different directives, EU directives covering compensation for victims, but there isn't, and we will see with the new draft directive on gender-based violence, there is not a specific tool dealing at European level, dealing with incidents of third-party violence and harassment at work. However, and this has been a running thread for our discussions, is that we can, and you would remember the researcher who did that very interesting report for the ILO, that we can actually tap into a number of existing legislation on health and safety, which is extremely important when dealing with, obviously, risk assessment and how to prevent violence and harassment and responding to it. We also have an EU legal framework against discrimination, whether it is based on gender or ethnic origin or disability, sexual orientation, age. So health and safety, anti-discrimination, all that is already at our disposal. So that also requires from social partners, from health and safety experts, from labor inspectors. Labor inspectors, we haven't much discussed the role of labor inspectors, but surely they have quite an important one to play. So it takes quite a holistic approach to the issue, because we don't really have, in terms of legislation, one single instrument to deal with it, or at least not yet. So that's it for the introduction. I'd like to also underline that you have in your meeting documents a background document, which Jane and I drafted, just to also refresh a bit the memory of those who took part from the start in this project. And so we tried already to couch on paper what could be the updating elements for the guidelines. And you also have on the agenda 4 questions, which we would like to pick your brain upon and see whether we can find some answers or beginning of answers for the follow-up to this project. So I hope we're all on the same page, that you had the chance to look at the background documents. And yeah, thank you. And please don't forget to switch off your mic. Thanks. Gregory or Gador, would you like to say a couple of words from your end? One, two, three.
Well, nothing really to add, just to say that it's a very important joint project. And I think that you have mentioned the different organizations that are that appear as organizations involved: HOSPIN, EPSU, SDESI, and the co-applicants with the UPay. And of course, this has started with the signing of the guidelines in 2010, and let's see what we should do 12 years later with those guidelines. Hopefully we will reach some common solution at the end of this webinar, which is a bit different from the other webinars. So for me, that's all. I don't know if Gregory wants to add anything else.
Hello, everyone. Yes, thank you, Gador. So from my side, I think the 4 questions are really essential. I think it really underlines where we want to go with this project. I think we've done quite a tremendous amount of work in collecting best practices and trying to move forward. I think it's really, really important. It's really, really on topic. And I really think that we must find a way to make it more concrete in reality. We know that the guidelines were issued, translated, shared, but actually the echo is not what we were expecting. And so we need to find a way to make it more concrete. And I hope that in the seminar we will have fruitful discussions to try to reach that objective. Thank you.
Many thanks, Gregory and Gador. Yes, indeed. I think there is another layer to this project, is indeed to how can we, and in the context of the ongoing review of the EU social dialogue, which the Commission is currently doing, leading on to a communication and a Council recommendation in the autumn, it's extremely important that, whatever we do here in, well, I dare say in Brussels, but here online, and hopefully we will soon meet in flesh, is to make sure that it makes sense and has meaning also for obviously employees and managers at the national level. So indeed, how to make things we do concrete on the ground is extremely, extremely important. And Gador, no, I don't think I mentioned all the partners of the project, but you have here the logos of the different organizations. So let me just mention them again. The employers for the local and regional governments, CMR, OSPIM for the healthcare sector, TESI, another trade union confederation, ETUC, that's the trade union for the education sector, EUPAE, central government, so that's your organization, Gador, UITP, so that's the Transport Employers Federation, ETF, the trade union for the transport sector, and ETNO, Gregory's organization for the telecom sector. So again, the emphasis is very much on public services and what is distinctive to the public services, but also to compare and contrast with one private sector, in this case, the telecoms. And clearly, for working in a hospital, if there is a patient who is abusing staff, well, there is a duty to care for all patients. So there is clearly something very special for public services, is that you have to find ways because you cannot exclude people. Yeah. So it's obviously the best way to go about it is to prevent violence from taking place in the first place. But there is this public sector ethos that is extremely obviously important for us. So, right, so that's for the different organizations. So welcome again to everyone. And I will now pass on the floor to Jane Pillinger, our great project consultant, who will focus on the research findings on the national implementation of the guidelines and see where we are at. And that will then take us to quite neatly to the separate discussion on what it is we can do to improve the guidelines. So Jane, thanks again for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I want to just share a couple of slides, but I think that's it. So I can do that now. Brilliant. Okay, well, hello everybody. Really delighted to see so many people here today, and I'm really looking forward to the discussions taking place between the employers and the trade unions about the future role of the guidelines. And I would really just want to say a few words welcoming I think the findings from both the survey and also from the partners involved in the project, that there is, real commitment to trying to do something about this growing problem of violence and harassment from third parties, particularly in the context of the pandemic and post-pandemic returning to full service levels of provision and so on. So the survey I've carried out and the interviews I've carried out have really helped to, I think, focus us on the need for both the updating of the guidelines, but also, as various people have said, making them concrete, making sure that they're effectively disseminated in the future and brought into reality. So some of you may have heard me giving presentations previously on other aspects of the survey, but I just wanted to say from the results of the online survey that we carried out, we had 165 full responses from 19 countries. Highest levels were from prisons, followed by hospitals, education, and urban transport. 59 responses from trade union organisations, 87 from employer trade unions, and 19 were unspecified, but some of those were from European level organisations. In terms of types of third-party violence and harassment, very similar kind of across all sectors, actually. We've done a separate analysis by sector, but very similar experiences of types of violence and harassment. So verbal harassment, which is often aggressive shouting and name calling and verbal abuse, comes out as being the highest level and form of violence and harassment, followed by forms of psychological harassment, which could be threats as well, and physical violence and assault are the third most common form of third-party violence and harassment. Everybody responding to the survey, or the vast majority of people responding from survey, and indeed in the interviews that I've carried out with both employers and trade union organisations, and those interviews are ongoing, they haven't been completed. I have still some more interviews to do, but confirm that this is a growing problem. And then the final point, which is interesting in relation to the implementation of the guidelines, is that when measures have been agreed, nearly half were jointly agreed with unions and employers. In fact, that I just have a quick slide on this because I think this gives some indication, and maybe also just to say, even though, as Nadia had mentioned, the guidelines haven't been used as a direct mechanism for agreements at national level and so on, there have been quite a lot of initiatives carried out at either the employer or the joint union management level in different sectors. There's been a lot of initiatives actually taking place in the last 10 years, is that often they're not referenced into the guidelines. So what we found, this is the measures introduced on third-party violence and harassment. And what I've done here, and I think this is really just to help your discussions in the employer and the trade union group, I've just separated out some of these findings by employer and trade union. So and you see in that the largest number of agreements actually were those that were some were jointly agreed. The second highest number were all jointly agreed. You'll see that the orange bar is the employer responses and the blue bar are the trade union responses. And you'll see that just over 15% of unions and employer responses said no measures have been introduced at all. So there have been some that have been introduced just by the employer and some just by the trade union. So we've seen kind of mixed responses in terms of whether there are joint approaches, but I think as Nadia and said, and Gregory also confirmed, actually there's such value in the joint approaches because both employers and unions bring in separate perspectives and knowledge and awareness about how to implement measures around the prevention and mitigation of third-party violence and harassment. Generally, in relation to the guidelines, what we've seen is quite a low level of awareness of the guidelines, but much greater level of awareness, interestingly, amongst the employers than unions. And I'd just like to say, as somebody who does research at the international level on issues of violence and harassment, even though there's a low level of awareness reported by employer and union organisations, the guidelines have had quite a kind of a profile at the international level as being one of the main instruments internationally in addressing this issue. So they have been used, I'm aware of how they've been used as references in countries in Africa, in Asia, in Canada, where they actually have quite a high level of kind of legal coverage and legal importance given to third-party violence and harassment. They have been used quite widely as a reference document. And there may be something that there's some learning from this about how a set of guidelines can be used as a as well as a framework for social partner agreements at the European level, but also, you know, perhaps a wider reference document about what are the best practices. So it's kind of nice to know that they've been referenced quite a few times in international reports and documents. And I know during the negotiations for Convention 190, they were referred to several times by government representatives and by the workers' group as being good practices. And I think that helped to bring in some really important learning about the inclusion of third-party violence and harassment in the final text of Convention 190. Just in terms of suggestions for additional guidance or other measures, I just thought I'd put these, some of you might have seen this slide before, but I've broken this down this time by employer and trade union. So again, the employer is the orange bar, the trade unions are the blue bar. And actually it's quite interesting when you look at, you know, what are the kind of, I suppose, you know, what the different perspectives from the unions and the employers groups. So sharing of best practice or sharing of good practice is identified by the employers as being one of the most important, useful additional guidance that, what can be an important part of the guidance, that they share best practice approaches so that they become that kind of reference document. But you can see the differences. So if I go from the bottom upwards, sharing of good practices, we see that's a preference for the employers. If we look at the next one, which I think is really interesting and perhaps is one which is relatively new as an issue, is about risk assessment and prevention. So I think we've had a lot of learning in the last 10 years about how to carry out prevention programs and risk assessment. So substantial numbers of both employers and unions see that as being important. Information campaigns directed at third parties, also quite important in terms of both employers and unions. More sectoral specific guidance was seen as important as well, but perhaps less so important for the employers. And perhaps that's because the guidelines can be seen as a reference point that then lead to perhaps more specific guidelines that can be drawn up at a sectoral level and agreed perhaps through, in the future, through the sectoral social dialogue committees. You know, you could see this as a starting point for more sectoral specific guidance, as has been developed already in the transport sector through the transport employers and unions at the European level and indeed at the international level. Guidance on confidential reporting and complaint systems also highlighted, binding measures at the EU level. Again, this became something more preferred by the trade unions. And then finally, guidance on addressing gender-based violence and harassment. given the both the context and awareness of sexual harassment and sexist forms of aggression and so on, but also, and included in this project, the impact of domestic violence issue. So those are just some of the suggestions for additional guidance. To say in terms of the survey and the interviews, slides if you want to have reference to them. But I just want to say about some of the themes that stand out as really as just a summary of both the survey and the interviews I've carried out, and I have also, as part of the project, been reviewing kind of literature and policy and other guidance documents that have been drawn up in recent years. So some key themes stand out. One is the need, and increasingly the focus on gender-based violence and harassment, including domestic violence, and also a recognition of the intersectional approach. And we looked at this in the second webinar, but also some evidence about when we look at the issue of gender-based violence through the gender lens, that actually there are certain groups of women who are more disproportionately affected by third-party violence and harassment, either because they're in low-paid or insecure jobs. And we see, for example, that Black and minority ethnic women or migrant women may be at greater risk of gender-based violence and harassment because they're in more vulnerable positions in the labour market. Then there are all of the new risks that we've identified in the world of work, including different patterns of working through working from home, the new patterns of hybrid working that we're seeing, part working from home, part in the office, and then the return to office and on-site working. And the new risks that we're seeing emerging in the world of work, particularly in this issue around digital forms of third-party violence and harassment. And I think this is going to be an important part of any new agreements that are developed on violence and harassment, in all forms of violence and harassment, including third-party violence and harassment. So digitalization has become a really important part of our recognition of how we address this issue, when sometimes we don't even know who the abuser is, because the third party could be an anonymous abuser using digital forms of violence and harassment. So how do we protect workers from this? How do we prevent it, and how do we change culture so that it becomes less prevalent? The next area that is perhaps really, really important, and one that we've seen much greater attention, is bringing the issue into occupational safety and health, so that third-party violence and harassment becomes a core part of the risk that is prevented. So that means looking at how to integrate third-party violence and harassment into risk assessment and risk mitigation measures, and bringing that into prevention plans. And I think there's two models for this. One is bringing it into risk assessment, where risk assessment is a standalone assessment of third-party violence and harassment risks, or that it becomes integrated into existing occupational safety and health risk assessments. So it's a regular part of this. And there's been some really interesting work done on this area. And I think one of the really important, along with digital forms of violence and harassment, this is one of the new areas, actually, that we're seeing more attention being given by the social partners. Then there's some really good practices of what works that we've picked up in country case studies around prevention, de-escalation techniques, how you train workers and managers to find solutions to bring down levels of stress so that they can protect themselves, working with the judicial authorities and bringing in kind of joint approaches, because sometimes the third-party violence is being carried out by a third party who may not be employed by the organisation, so it requires some criminal law, sometimes interventions as well from the judicial authorities. And then good practices on what works in joint approaches, and particularly social dialogue and collective bargaining agreements. And the guidelines have, as we say, as we've said, are cross-sectoral, but there's some nice examples of some sector-specific guidance that has been drawn up. I mentioned earlier the transport sector, but in some countries, some very specific guidelines and work carried out in the health sector, for example. And then the final finding really from both the surveys and the interviews is actually the importance now of Convention 190 and Recommendation 206. And just in terms of, this is the ILO Convention on Violence and Harassment, which hasn't yet still been ratified at the EU level, which is the normal practice around Convention 190, but we are waiting for a very soon a recommendation that will be issued from, we're hoping, from the European Commission that just gives the go-ahead for countries in Europe to ratify the convention. And most countries in Europe actually are at the stage where they're ready to fully ratify. And already ratification has taken place in Italy, Spain, and Greece. And we're likely to see this ratification happening very soon across most European countries. Sorry, UK is also ratified. Ireland is about to ratify. So we're going to see most European countries ratifying fairly soon. Albania has ratified as well, so I keep missing out the broader context in Europe. So those are some of the key themes that have stood out from just a quick overview. And I just wanted to say a couple of words about, the different approaches. I mean, it's quite interesting that different countries have different approaches to addressing workplace policies or collective bargaining on violence and harassment. And part of this is to do with different legal frameworks, but it's also, different ways and different approaches to bringing third-party violence and harassment. In some cases, where there are national or sectoral agreements, what we've seen is that third-party violence and harassment comes into this as part of broader clauses on violence and harassment at work. So it becomes, there's a section that deals with violence and harassment, where third-party violence and harassment is part of that. And then increasingly, and this is really interesting development, increasingly we're seeing occupational safety and health agreements and workplace policies, including those on the work environment that address workplace violence and harassment, including risk assessment and psychosocial risks. So there are quite a few countries in Europe now that are very focused on this issue about risk assessment and psychosocial risks. And indeed, those legal frameworks in countries like Belgium and the Netherlands, for example, take precedence over the legal frameworks on violence and harassment concerning gender equality and non-discrimination. And there may be situations where you've got these issues addressed in all of these areas, so that they're cross-referenced, and it's important there is cross-referencing. And then another big area of agreements and workplace policies has been in the area of gender equality and non-discrimination. So if I take, for example, the agreements in France on gender equality, in the last round of bargaining on gender equality, which is mandated in the law, and companies that are required to carry out regular gender equality bargaining, quite a few of those newly agreed gender equality agreements include both reference to domestic violence, including paid domestic violence leave for the first time, and also in some contexts, also third-party violence and harassment. So that's quite interesting. And similarly, I've been trying to review some of the agreements in Spain and Italy that also on gender equality and non-discrimination also bring in the issue of domestic violence and indeed also third-party violence and harassment as part of the broader context of sexual harassment and sexist and aggressive forms of abuse in the workplace. And then there have been some specific initiatives and specific agreements that really emerged as part of COVID-19, but also in response to new patterns of work, which address specific policies on digitalization and COVID-19 risks. And some of these were around the working environment, some of these were around occupational safety and health, and some were around gender equality as well. So we saw a whole raft of new initiatives and policies on these issues of digitalization and COVID-19 risks during the pandemic. So that perhaps gives a bit of a picture of the different routes into third-party violence and harassment, how this is being dealt with. In some cases, there may be a national sectoral agreement that addresses third-party violence and harassment, but might also be referenced in the occupational safety and health agreements as well, and indeed also in gender equality. So it can come in different contexts, and this all really depends on the structure of bargaining, whether there is sectoral bargaining and sectoral or national agreements, whether the social partners have been able to interpret in a broad sense the occupational safety and health regulations and directives at the European level. And it's interesting, the International Labour Conference just finished on Friday, and one of the main achievements of the last International Labour Conference was the agreement for occupational safety and health to now be listed as one of the fundamental labour rights, which is a huge development and really important. So I'm not going to say any more at this stage because I think it's important to get into the groups. I hope this has just given you a little bit of a framework to begin your discussions, and we'll be really, really interested to hear your discussions and have some feedback from you. So I don't know if there's any questions or comments, but I'll hand now back to Nadia. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Jane. That's very enlightening. And some of the things you've said are actually in that discussion document. And again, to really, I think it was quite interesting to note that the guidelines have had or continue to have bearing not just in Europe, but at international level, in Africa, Asia, you mentioned, and indeed during the discussions and negotiations of the ILO Convention 190. So that's extremely useful to know. And I was wondering, I'm not sure, I didn't take part in the drafting of the 2010 guidelines, but it also depends on what you expect. And again, the legal status of that document, that's guidelines. So that's not an agreement, but if they do what they are supposed to be doing, which is to guide the discussion, to inspire, and of course, to already raise awareness whilst you are drafting the guidelines or reporting back, that's already certainly an achievement. And another thing which also is puzzling, but perhaps it shouldn't be that puzzling, is the fact that at the national level, again, prevention, tackling third-party violence and harassment is usually integrated in broader collective agreements or policy frameworks, whether they deal with indeed health and safety, which is extremely critical to really deal and for social partners to be best placed to deal with third-party violence when it is actually anchored into occupational health and safety or integrated into gender equality agreements or anti-discrimination agreements. And indeed, as you mentioned, most recently on digitalization, and not least in relation to cyber violence, but also in terms of psychosocial risk, the protection of personal data, which can really increase psychosocial risk when you know that somewhere, someone or some people know so much about you and you're not quite sure what they do with those data. So protection of data becoming another very important topic. So our expectations, in fact, to see the guidelines, if that was our expectations, to see the guidelines being transposed into multisectoral agreements, that didn't happen really, but perhaps that was not the intention anyway in the first place. So that's where I mean, what you're trying to achieve also perhaps needs to be better spelled out, and it may be something we could do in the guidelines, is what it is we expect as EU social partners, we expect from national social partners to be doing. Otherwise, there can be, confusion. But that said, it's very useful to know that they did provide guidance, awareness raising, and that they continue indeed, as you mentioned, at the ILO level. Are there any questions for clarification or additional comments regarding the survey responses Jane just presented? And indeed, some of you probably responded to the survey. Obviously, then we will have a report later on, probably after the summer, Jane, that we will have then all the details in writing. Yeah. But would you have questions just now before we break in separate groups? And you used the yellow hand. I see a big blue hand from Jan's FNV poster. Okay, no comments or questions. And what I thought was also interesting and perhaps surprising is that there is more awareness on the guidelines from the employers, at least those who responded to the survey, than on the trade unions. So it means that there might be a bit of more homework to do from the trade union side. And Jane, would you know why there was such a high rate of response from the trade union group? I mean, I can have, and I see Manuela would like to take the floor, but I'm coordinating the trade union group for prison services. And is it clearly because there is more violence taking place, which doesn't have to be, I mean, a prison does not have to be a violent environment, not at all. But if there is an explanation, but before that, Manuela, please.
Sì, io sono Manuela Lupi, rappresento la FLAI CISL, che è un sindacato degli
CISL, which is an electrician trade union. Very briefly, well, as far as the guidelines are concerned, trade unions are very sensitive to this topic. And so following what Nadia just said, I must admit that it's because of our help, of trade unions' help, that the 2010 guidelines have been then ratified in the different workplaces. They were actually then put on the different company boards and were discussed. So trade unions are being sensitive to this kind of topics. And let's bear in mind that many other agreements, thanks to many other agreements that we have been able actually to set up, women who have been victims of violence could then enjoy different leaves from works, even in our sector, which is the electrical sector. And then I'll speak more during the group work. Thank you all.
Thanks, Manuela. Indeed, very progressive developments in Italy, providing exceptional leave for victims of violence, which is quite something as a development. Jane, you wanted to react to?
Yes, and your question was why were there a predominant number of responses from the prison service? I think there's two reasons. One is it's become a growing problem, and both the unions and the employers recognise this. But I think it's also in the context, and maybe Sarah from the Department of Justice in Belgium might want to add a word here, Sarah van Melderen, that actually there's been quite a big focus on on third-party violence and harassment in the context of new research that's being started in Belgium and a new project in Belgium about how to prevent this growing problem. And I think that's really generated a lot of discussion and interest amongst Belgian representatives in the survey. So Sarah, you might want to add something, but it might be something that you can discuss in your working group. But it is interesting that it's been, and I think also, we've seen in all of our webinar discussions, both employer and union representatives from the prison service are very focused on this issue.
Yes, Jane, maybe I can add some remarks also here in the plenary group. Indeed, it is becoming a growing problem, but it's also due to the fact that the profile of our prison population has also changed over the years, meaning that more and more prisoners have psychiatric disorders and mental problems. When you compare these problems, for example, 20 years ago, this profile was less problematic in terms of disorders, mental problems. So this is a trigger also for more violence that we observe every day in prisons. So I really think it is related to the specific profile of our clients, of the third party, in this case, the prisoners. So in that case, I think we are a bit, or in some ways, a bit specific or special, the prison population. And then also concerning the new projects that we are executing now in Belgium, not we, because it is a third party also who execute the research for us. But we are really focusing on, and this is a new initiative in the Belgian prisons, we are focusing to install a new culture, a culture based on less violence. So we really want to also make a change culturally wise in prisons. You know, that's certain, the Belgian prison system historically, we are very focused on repression from history. And we really want to make that change. We really want to go working with prisoners in another way, meaning more focusing on dialogue, communication, and as a last resort, we will isolate prisoners. But it's a new initiative, and we really try to experiment with certain initiatives. For example, we are thinking about mediation between prisoners, but also between prisoners and staff. But it is still in evolution. It is still in the framework of a research of really exploring what can we do in our prisons to reduce violence. So it's not yet finalized. The first phase of November. So in the end of November, we will have some results of 8 of our prisons. We have 34 prisons in Belgium. So end of November, we have results of 8 of our prisons. And based on that results, we want to extend the initiative, the project, to the other prisons. So it is really a new initiative that is in full development.
Many thanks, Sarah. And I think it takes us indeed to also the broader kind of politics and policy environment. And as you said, from moving from oppression-based to more democracy, really more dialogue, and finding alternative solutions. And sometimes you need to indeed challenge your mindset and culture if you want to make progress. Otherwise, whatever the tools you are using will not change much, because that's the broader environment which needs to be rethought out. Okay, now we're going to break into our separate groups. So for the trade union group, you just stay where you are. And the employers, I think Sarah put the link also on your in the chat. And to remind you that So there are those 4 questions on the agenda, which we will take one by one in the discussions and then share our responses in plenary. So we will come back to plenary at 12:15. And of course, if you want to break a bit earlier so that, you know, have a coffee, feel free to do so. Okay, so for the trade unions, you stay here. And Jane, you will be moving from one group to another. You'll be a satellite going. Okay. So since I don't know all of you, I trust you'll be all going to the right group. And I hope that there are a few employers reps though in the employers group. Okay. All right, so I'm going to screen share again the questions, but before I do so, are there any questions regarding the way to go about it, the project, or you all feel very at ease on how we're going to proceed? Okay, it's all clear? Brilliant. Okay. So, oh yeah, sorry, and I forgot to say that Marcella, you will be our rapporteur. You'll be entrusted with this task of summing up the discussion in plenary. Is that correct?
Yes, thank you, Nadia. And
Brilliant.
please dare to, of course, to correct if I forget something important or if you want to correct something. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm sure it won't be necessary. Okay, so let's move on. The first question is, well, it's maybe a bit of a tough one, but for those of you at least who have taken part in the project from the outset, I'm sure you will you will probably agree with the questions, which is, do you agree that the guidelines, so the multisectoral guidelines, need to be updated? I mean, we do not have a voting system, you know, no sort of pool thing. So perhaps the way of going about this is, for the first part of the question, are there anyone who don't think that the guidelines need to be updated? Maybe do you think the guidelines remain all very relevant and that recent legislation at national level or at ILO level, not least with the convention, which does put a link between gender-based violence and the workplace. I mean, that's actually the key thing of that convention, which does cover for domestic violence. Also, as Jane mentioned, is something we also discussed in greater depth earlier this year. So we can assume that everybody agrees that it needs a bit of a refresh. And in fact, it's very striking that at the national level, when you agree agreements or policies with the employers, you would always revise those documents. You would not leave them like 10 years later without having touched them. So that's a bit of the unique feature of the European kind of social dialogue. And it goes without saying that obviously, 12 years later, it's unlikely that something doesn't need a bit of a refresh. So, okay. So, yeah, Paola, sorry, and Michael.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I just had one question in terms of sentence, because I think when we talk about cyber violence, domestic violence, digitalization, do we have to spell out the issue of telework, the issue of new forms of working, new working arrangements, or do you think is understood if we leave the questions like this? Because the point is, we heard even in the plenary that this was a fundamental point, but I think also the link between domestic violence and cyber violence is somehow where we work and how post-COVID or how COVID arrangements will become post-COVID normality. And I was wondering if it's already very clear, or do we need to spell it out? Because I don't think that would be controversial, to be honest. Thank you.
Yep, thanks, Paola, Michael, and then Adam.
Hello. First of all, apologies to the interpreters, because I realized 2 minutes before the meeting that I left my headset at home. So I hope it's still possible to hear what I'm saying. My name is Mikael Rukel. I'm from Vision. It's a public sector union from Sweden. I would just like to ask Nadia, at this stage, do you just want a yes or no to the question, or is this also the place where we can discuss potentially what kind of updates and changes we'd like to see? Thank you.
Perhaps I can answer straight away this one. I think, yes, on the, do you agree that the guidelines need to be updated? We would expect a yes or a no. But at the same time, you know, Jane's survey did raise that question, and the findings seem to indicate that, yes, they need to be updated. Again, if only to take into account recent legislative developments or the ILO convention. So we would expect a quick yes to that one, and the discussion focusing on what should be the key elements for the revisions. And as Paola mentioned, I mean, it's not, we don't take for granted, you know, the issues of digitalization, gender-based violence. I mean, obviously they would need to be further defined, and that could be part of the exercise. But regarding telework, for instance, yes, that's a new great development. In some countries, there was zero telework. In some, well, in public administrations, for instance, as we often mention, in Italy, for instance, and now it's, you know, it's gone totally as a new way of working. And here, obviously, there are two ways of looking at it. I mean, if you are at work and you are subject to physical violence or verbal abuse, dealing with a patient, I mean, dealing with a citizen, user, or client. If you're at home, that's one less risk you have. But there are other risks, not least, well, it could be cyber violence, because the frustrations of users not being able to speak to someone can resort to verbal violence out of frustration. But of course, it can also be, you know, domestic violence if your home environment is actually awful, and who is responsible for that? And that we also discussed, and we could complement the guidelines with some recent developments, not least in terms also of litigation, as we have seen that the home becoming the workplace, while the employer remains the one responsible for a safe workplace. So here there is certainly a new aspect of the discussion that would need to be taken into account, I would think, in the possible revision of the guidelines. Adam, you would like to say something?
Yes, so I mean, for us, it's obviously a yes, and I think for hosting as well, because we already had the updated version of our framework of actions on recruitment and retention from 2010. And so yes, but the question is, for us in the hospital sector, healthcare sector, a larger one, it's also important the staffing level, no? So it's not only about, you know, domestic violence and so on and so forth. It's very much related to general working conditions, because that's COVID showed that if you don't have enough personnel, then the patients are getting really aggressive towards you. So yeah, I mean, well, that's what I wanted to say, only just like that.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that's where I think to really consider all different all different aspects, indeed, in terms of work organization, working conditions that could be conducive to a violent behavior must really be perhaps better thought out. And the lack of staff is certainly part of, psychosocial risk, and also can lead on to violent behavior. And that clearly should be part of, for instance, the risk assessment and the health risk assessment. Do you actually have sufficient staff to do the job? Seems to be quite an important one.
And it's not only in health, no, it's also social care. So just
I think we are facing this. I mean, it could be staffing levels, and then how, work organization across many different public services. Prison services was mentioned, and yes, there is also a shortage. I mean, in some countries, it has got very difficult to recruit, actually, prison officers. But yeah, so staffing levels should really remain on our radar. Paola, the yellow hand is still on your screen. Oh, okay, no. So for the first question, do you agree that the guidelines need to be updated? It seems that there is a broad consensus, and it is great, actually, that for already 2 sectors, so local and regional governments and healthcare, as you mentioned, Adam, there is already consensus that the guidelines need to be revamped. So I don't know if anyone, so no objection to the revision process, which is part of the project. That's very good. And you have in the questions a list of possible topics that could be part of the revisions. It's also in your background discussion document. I would like to ask whether you agree that those topics should be part of the revisions, and second, whether there are any issues we have forgotten. And again, Adam, thanks a lot for that. I mean, it's not we have forgotten them, but staffing levels has always remained a sort of cross-cutting issue, but we'll make sure that it's spelled out in the next kind of joint documents. But are there anything else you can think about? Manuela, please. I see you have a yellow hand, so.
Yes, of course, there are more exposed sectors. The colleague have indicated the health and prison sectors, but I think that all private sectors are relevant. In my trade union, we also take charge of other sectors. And I think that many sectors have problems concerning violence, because I think that violence concerns all working places. Previously, we made a reference to teleworking with our relationship with the pandemic. So it is important to indicate here the reference with domestic violence, because with teleworking, family problems get worse, because you are brought to have more contacts, more family contacts, and more violence. In any case, I think that all sectors are relevant. Therefore, I think there is a profound need to review the guidelines, not just in general terms, but also at company level. I think we need a new risk assessment in any sector, because I think that this problems is present in all the sectors. I don't think that there are more dangerous sectors. I think that this problem is typical of any sectors. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Manuela. Yes, I think it seems based on previous research from the European Foundation, there was some, it depends on which type of violence then you're talking about, but in terms of physical violence, verbal abuse, so which is still quite a physical thing, it's still sectors dealing with people, obviously, that would be more subject to third-party violence. But now, or workers, so dealing with people, dealing with money, security sector, banking sector, especially after the financial crisis in 2008. But then with cyber violence and indeed mass teleworking, you can think that, okay, verbal abuse online obviously can affect, you know, all sectors. That's certainly potentially a possibility. And Manuela, I take your point again on domestic violence, which should be part of the revision. And indeed here, I think the Italian example will be extremely useful and timely for the revision process. Now I see yellow hands for Dominique and Ettore. Dominique, à ton tour, merci.
Good morning to all of you. I wanted to intervene. We had a seminar in Toulouse in the fall, and we tackled the issue of reception of the users. And we realized that in some sectors, the reception is no longer physical, but it's totally digital, which leads to issues in terms of the contacts with the administration. So it is not explicitly mentioned in your questions, but maybe it's a matter also to tackle, because it creates misunderstandings, for instance, when there are issues of connections. And from our own retirement, I had to approach the administration. Some services are still partly physical reception. There are physical reception desks, but at national level, some approaches are purely digital, and the contacts have to be purely digital, with questionnaires, digital questionnaires to fill in. And when you have technical issues, there is no one to speak to. So I don't know whether this particular aspect is already taken aboard. It should be. We had a testimony of a colleague, a social worker, who told us that people are totally lost because of that, and the only remedy they have is to approach the social services, hence huge waiting lists. These mainly concerns sectors with the national responsibility in the local authorities. And I take my own example. Many of the contacts are still physical, let's say. Thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that will be taken into account, because we're looking at the drivers, the factors of violence, and indeed the fact that there is no one to speak to is certainly, you know, on public services is certainly an issue. And I saw that in France, there was a court case recently, which basically in a nutshell forbids public services to be only available online. And that was in relation to asylum seekers, just or migrants trying to renew. I think it was not asylum seekers. There were migrants trying to renew their work permit and couldn't do it because of the services being online, and therefore we, you know, facing the situation where the French administration is producing undocumented migrants just because it's not available. There is no one to actually process the request, or it's being delayed. And anyway, the court case really bans online-only services, and I think that's quite an important case, because indeed we hear of, well, the fact that people don't have the right, sufficient internet connection, and that's still 7 or 8% of the EU population, probably more, probably is a conservative estimate. And then not to be able to speak to someone, even online, or to have just a meeting online, seems really extremely shocking. So that is driving indeed frustration and possibly verbal abuse when users are just desperate to have their file processed. And so that certainly is something we will keep, Dominique. So thanks for that. Ettore, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I would like to add something concerning the education sector, because I represent the Italian trade union in the education field. In Italy, something has been done. Even the possibility to obtain a paid leave for the victims of violence. However, these actions are not enough, and we will insist on this. In the education sector, in the schools, there are many problems in terms of TPVH. Parents and older students can perpetrate violence, so it is a very big problem. Sorry, the audio is not very good. Within CESI, we had many debates on this. We find this as a common problem. Another element, maybe it was already raised, the problem of pandemic. During the pandemic, there were problems in terms of distance learning. I don't want to mention all the details, but I think we need a focus on this, on distance online learning. So these are the two main topics I would like to raise in the education field, because during the pandemic, millions of students and teachers had to change, to migrate towards online education with many problems, also technical problems. But all this created many interpersonal problems. Thank you very much, and thank you for giving me the floor.
Thanks, Ettore. So Jan and Lara, and just to remind, we are still on the first question. If there is any issues we have missed out, either in the question, probably, but also in the discussion document. Thank you. Jan and then Lara.
Yes, thank you, Nadia. What I wanted to mention, I'm from Jan Schriever from FNV, the Netherlands, and I'm doing healthcare. And especially in my hospital, we had problems on the first aid department where visitors came and were quite aggressive to the nurses and took their mobile telephone and took pictures or videos and say, oh, now I know who you are, and I will put it online. And I'm not, so we try to ban that. So in our rules, we wrote that down, but it's still a very big issue because you can mention it, but people don't listen. And So I want that subject as well mentioned, because that's for us a big problem. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Jan. And you think this is specific to the pandemic, or the pandemic has actually exacerbated already instances of violence and abuse?
It was already before the pandemic, but of course, during the pandemic, even more was happening, of course. If you are not allowed to visit your family and you have to tell that, and people come and make a picture of you and say, oh, I now I have your picture, and they spread it even on social media. And then you have to, as the victim, to explain that it was something else. But it's very often local social media, and people will say something against you.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
And is that something you have tackled in a health protocol or in a collective agreement, or is it?
We have the house rules how people have to behave in the hospital. So we have that everywhere displayed, but still, Adam mentioned already, with the lack of personnel that we have, you are there alone, and you have to tell, oh, you can read it there, and they say, well, you want, I want to be helped, and sometimes there's a delay in that, where. And yeah, it gives a bit of a problem still.
Yeah. Thanks. Lara?
Yes, I would like to make some additional comments. It is fundamental and essential to develop the guidelines for all the sectors. I'm sure that the pandemic highlighted many problems. As Jan has just indicated, there is a lack of staff. The nurses and in general in public services, the staff has difficulties in providing answers to all the users. We had many problems online and in presence, but especially in presence services, we have encountered many problems, especially in the social sectors, because the staff has to interact with people with many mental problems. So apart from the sectors mentioned by Ettore, we had many problems with the youth, with young people. And even maybe the guidelines could help, could intervene in the school sectors to include many users. Nowadays, we see many problems expressed by the youth within the school. And because of these increasing problems with the youth, we could organize meetings. We could set up meetings between the teachers and the students so that we could create awareness on this topic. Such meetings could really help. And I also think that we would need meetings to talk about such guidelines. There should be a debate on this. So it is very important to make people meet. So, for example, meetings amongst workers, so that the problems could be shared, and so that the problems could be well underlined. So it's important to talk about the problems among themselves and among the workers and the users. it is important to share common problems because professionals are facing many problems, and it is important to share and to talk among the workers. A dialogue among the workers is fundamental. The dialogue has to be maintained. It is important to talk about the many abuses on the workplaces. And it is important to highlight these many problems which are increasing now. It is a real problem, and dialogue is fundamental. After the dialogue, we need to tackle the problem in a very concrete way. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, what you just said relates to the person who spoke about the prison services, that you also need a dialogue between well, prison officers and prisoners or inmates. So that's an important important tool. And I suppose that after 2 years of pandemic and lockdowns, the need to talk is probably even more important than ever. So that we can also add as an additional issue. I mean, the guidelines do provide for constant involvement of workers in the definition of policy, in the follow-up, the implementation, of course. But perhaps it's more of a broader sort of exchanges and dialogue also between, yes, the setting, the public service in that case, and the users, and how it can be organized, perhaps also with the local authorities. Yeah, I mean, I think that could be also one thing to add. Mikael, please, from Sweden.
Thank you. I have one more issue that is in a way relating both to domestic violence and of course gender-based violence, but I still think it could be worth to mention separately. And at least in Sweden, we sometimes discuss how Convention 190 should be implemented when it comes to the issue of employers' responsibilities for violence that occurs in the home or outside of work. And I think this is in some ways a tricky issue, because we also at the same time need, of course, to consider the personal integrity of the victim very carefully. And this is, I think, a concrete example where there could be some room for improvement, because last week in Sweden we have something presented in the news that exposed a quite significant deficiency in the Swedish labor law. It's a case where a woman had been exposed to severe violence and rape from her ex-husband. And while the ex-husband was in prison, the authorities helped in some ways because they arranged some protective measures for her. She could change her name, her address, and the identity. But the weak link in this case was her job. She lived in a hidden address, she had a new name, but the employer had no legal obligation to offer her a job at another supermarket. She was working in a supermarket. And that was even though this was a large chain of different supermarkets. So I think this case, however, the employer has any kind of obligations to help out in these cases is something that we could also discuss in the guidelines. I don't think that this should be regulated binding at EU level, because the national systems are of course very different. And I also think that such an obligation must be different depending on the size of the employer and depending on the sector. But I think that this could be highlighted in the guidelines and perhaps subject to national legislation and collective agreements. So that was my proposal. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. In fact, we've already kind of touched upon that, and the way we are going to proceed is by an exchange of good practices and good policies, and indeed in terms of the employer's responsibility, but also as and I think there would be consensus on that, is at least how to facilitate and how to prevent, again, the victim of violence, of domestic violence, from losing their job. And that certainly is the key priority. And there are examples again in France and Italy, but also outside the European Union, where the employer can indeed be more proactive in for changing the location of the job of the person. So that's certainly, so that will be as a start in a pool of good practices and good policies. And just the fact of talking about it, at least that there is a space to, if the person wants to, obviously there is no obligation either, but that there should be a safe space for actually tackling the issue and getting the support, and including, as was mentioned in Italy, exceptional paid leave that you need to sort out, whatever, administrative litigation, finding a new place, a new school, or etc. So that will certainly be highlighted. Thanks. Okay, I'd like to move on to the second question. Otherwise, we're not going to go through the question unless there is a burning desire to add something, that even if that's just an idea, it's a brainstorm. So, just don't feel obliged to expand on what you say, but you think, oh, have you thought of that? Is that something you've looked at as part of the new issues, or something which, not massive evidence at national level that this is happening, but I heard this is something, that our attention might be drawn to. Anything else? I can't see any yellow hands. No? Okay. Well, if you have something else to add, we can always go back to the first question. So the second one is a bit more, well, I don't know if it's a bit more technical, but again, the question is, do you think it's still relevant to deal separately with external violence, so violence from users, patients, clients, and so separately from internal violence and harassment, i.e. from colleagues or management? And again, the guidelines were drawn up specifically on third-party violence because the cross-sectoral agreement on violence and harassment of 2007 was only mentions third-party violence, but left it to national social partners to decide whether or not they want to deal with it. So at the time, 12 years ago, we thought, no, clearly, certainly, especially for public services, education, healthcare, etc. Security services also at the time were very active. Now, we think there is here an issue on how to deal with violence coming from, it's outside. Perhaps it shouldn't be called external, actually, violence, because then it means, well, it's outside the workplace. And yet, no, this is part of your, it can be part of the daily job of someone dealing with abusive patients or clients. But now with cyber violence, so a sort of new form of violence, well, based on the little research, comparative research, which is now available, well, it seems that cyber violence comes, it's often anonymous, but on the basis of the evidence, again, which remains very limited, it seems to come more often from colleagues or management. So it's more a case of internal violence or harassment. So how do we go about it? Is there anything at the national level that, have you ever actually, or maybe that's another way of putting it, but have you, in terms of policy documents, and Jane again said that there are a few measures available, but policy or collective agreements, did you actually deal specifically with external violence, or usually that's violence in general, and as we know, also related to health and safety, gender equality? So we need here a bit some inputs from your experience at the national level. Should we continue splitting both external and internal violence? Any takes on that? Yes, I see One yellow hand. But I can't see your name for some reason, so that's a lady. I saw first a lady. It's not Michael. So Michael, Manuela, and Jan, you're on the list, but there was a lady and I can't see her name. So if that lady without a name, at least on my screen, wants to take the floor first, and then Michael, Manuela, and Jan. Thank you.
So shall I start, although Jan raised his hand before me?
Oh,
anyway.
Go on, Manuela. Yeah, it's fine.
Or maybe the lady whom we don't know her name. Can I take the floor now? Says
oh, sorry, I see it.
Manuela.
Sorry.
Okay, now I can see you. I can see you all.
Yeah, sorry, I can see now Sandra. Then I'd rather give
Sandra,
the floor to
finally.
someone who hasn't spoken yet. Yeah, if you don't mind, Sandra, and then Manuela, Jan, Michael.
Be connected. For example, in prison and in many workplaces, there is a violence environment. I think there is a kind of violence subculture. And so there is a strictly connected between these two aspects. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Sandra. Manuela, please, you have the floor.
Very well, thank you. I believe that although there are analogies from these two types of violence, I do believe that there are still differences. And I'm referring also to the Italian law. And I suppose that it's the same for other legislations. When we talk about internal violence or internal harassment, we must also then bear in mind mobbing, which is a subtype of colleagues or management behavior. Violence and harassment, third-party violence, so from clients or patients, depending on the sector we're dealing with, does not determine such a consequence, but just an assessment or a risk assessment on behalf of the employer, so that they or it can make sure that third-party behaviors do not lead to any consequences for an employee. It is also true that certain internal behaviors, so mobbing, are responsibilities of management, but are in a way more manageable because an employer can assess and can impose or suggest through training projects or vocational projects, for instance, they can actually work and condition its employees with the aim of eradicating violence or harassment in the company. Third-party violence are not very foreseeable, can happen very quickly, or they have already happened. And so that is why they are foreseeable. And this kind of violence, third-party violence, as I read in the shared documents, can actually involve or get involved maybe law enforcement authorities, so that some aggressive and violent behaviors can be halted. Let's, for instance, think of those who work at a point that they work for a bank, or they are dealing with clients. Of course, they may be faced to some sort of violent reaction by a client. So, and in this case, the employer can foresee some barriers, glasses, or screens that can protect actually the employee. But from an internal violence point of view, well, it's more difficult then to apply any screen or barriers. But of course, from this point of view, we must actually dwell on the issue, so that maybe we could then reach a single document with some specificities, because in my opinion, we could then find different solutions according to the different issues.
Yeah, thanks, Manuela. Internal and external violence, yeah, they each have their own distinctive features and probably responses. But at the same time, whether they should be kept separate in terms of how you deal with it, in terms of whether it's a collective agreement on health and safety, that's where, yeah, I don't know actually, but yes, certainly they are different and different, yeah, it's different features, which is why we wanted to tackle it in the first place. Let's see now next, Jan, then Michael, and then Barbara. Jan, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Nadia. I think it's important to have a talk about all the violence in our agreement in the hospitals. It is so. It's not only the third party, but also the violence among colleagues. But it is quite hard to do something against your manager. So you have to have an independent person where you can go with your complaint, because otherwise your manager will do something against you what you don't like, and it will be even more. In the risk assessments, it should be also mentioned. And but we have seen with Me Too that not all these things are quite well dealt with. So it's also important for the employers, because when there is not a nice environment to work, when there is aggression, then violence, then people might leave the job or even get sick or something. So it's for the employers also important to do something against it. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yes, well, I don't know, kind of on a gut feeling that a violent working environment or an environment which can let abuse take place would lead on at some point to also external violence. And I was wondering the extent to which there is this continuum of violence. And we know that on gender-based violence, this is something which we find, very often, this continuum of violence in someone's life, subject also to domestic violence, and that the response of public authorities has often also been an experience of failing. So just like, but anyway, take your point. Michael, then Barbara, and then Patricia. Sorry. Michael.
Thank you. And I will need to agree with what some of the other colleagues already have said to some parts. I think it's essential to keep those perspectives separate, at least to some extent. I would, if we still think that it could be useful to also have an integrated approach, I would rather suggest that we try to split this into 3 different sections. That would be one section about issues that are specific to internal workplace violence, and one about issues specific to external third-party violence. And then finally, in that case, a section about those issues that are common for all kinds of harassment and violence in the workplace. Mm. And the reason why I think it's important or meaningful to maintain this separation is because as a worker, you have the right to expect different things from your employer depending on who the perpetrator is. In case of internal workplace violence, the employer can use a different toolbox given by the labor law, which could be, for instance, suspension, wage deduction, or termination of the employment, in addition to other measures given by the criminal law. While in the case of third-party violence, the employer has to be more reliant on actions by the police or other authorities to be taken against the perpetrator, which makes a different approach might be needed. However, I also think that there are aspects, particularly in terms of preventive measures about risk assessment and about education and training, that we could consider to address in a more integrated manner, if we think that that could be a fruitful way forward. So that's my proposal. Thank you.
Very useful. Thanks. Yeah, absolutely. At the same time, harassment is part of criminal law now. So harassment from colleagues or management could still be subject, in fact, well, to criminal law and not limited to labor law. So
exactly.
That's again where the bridges are.
That's what I meant. That when the harassment or the violence comes from someone internally at the workplace, we can expect the employer to use a much broader toolbox. They have both the tools given by the criminal law, but also by the labor law. While it's different if the violence comes from a third person. That's what I meant. Sorry.
Okay, no, that's clear. Sorry, it's me who didn't get it. Okay, great. Thanks. Barbara, and then Patricia, and Ettore. Barbara, please.
Thank you very much. I agree with Mika. In Hungary, I think it is very important to keep these 2 categories separate, because it is becoming more and more general and more enhanced that we are experiencing a sort of repression and threat from the employer's side and from the authorities. So we are being threatened of losing our jobs if we speak out, then we have no one to turn to. Even the legislator doesn't support us. So we are lacking all sorts of support. And even a manager who is harassing or who is aggressive can also make measures against a third party that is being violent towards the employees, but this same person is not going to take the same measures, the same steps against himself or herself, and sometimes they don't even realize that their attitude is harassment or aggression. And maybe if the legislative context changed, then maybe we could employ pressure or apply pressure on these persons to actually go to training and realize what's happening. But this is non-existent in Hungary. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Barbara. Yeah, it's another issue, which is the taboo around violence. And obviously, sometimes, most often on purpose. So you don't talk about it, so it doesn't exist. And then the perpetrators can continue doing what they do. It will be interesting in Hungary to see how the government will react to the new draft gender-based violence directive, which unfortunately does not make the link with the workplace, but there are a couple of references to the role of social partners in the draft directive. And hopefully there will be further amendments also to that effect. But yes, sometimes you need to change the legislation.
Unfortunately, the Hungarian government is one of the biggest aggressors and harassers in this context.
Absolutely, we wouldn't disagree with that. So yeah, when it comes from the top, obviously it's much more difficult to make progress. But at least to have that discussion is is always important to keep it on the agenda. Thanks, Barbara. Which sector are you coming from, Barbara? In which sector?
The Democratic Federation of Trade Unions of Kindergarten Workers.
Okay, great. So kindergarten. Thank you. Patricia, and then Ettore.
Hi, hello everyone. I'm Patricia Lager from Madrid, and I also work in the railway sector, sorry, but we also represent telecommunications and other sectors within our federation. I wanted to highlight that I think that it's important to separate the approach regarding the different types of violence, third-party violence and violence at work through work colleagues, management, etc. Although there are differences, the type of harassment, for example, sometimes when we compare a client with management, sometimes clients also have the idea that they are above you in some respect. They might also be worse against women, LGBTI persons, or any other discriminated group. So conditions are different. It has already been mentioned, for example, if there's a specific event regarding a specific person, sometimes we don't even know who it is, because if it's a client, it's a third party, we don't know who they are. What we try to do is to make sure that this does not happen again, but we're not able to work with a client or a patient if we don't know who they are. They haven't identified themselves, there's no way we can work with them. So it's important to separate the two types of violence, external and internal, because there are no solutions that are appropriate for both cases, although maybe the origin of the violence might be the same. And I'll just say this because I know we're lagging a bit behind. Thank you.
That's very clear, Patricia. But I suppose perhaps what would be common is how to have a culture of non-violence, and then which could also reciprocate externally as well as internally. But I take your point absolutely, as it was said by other speakers, of keeping a separate approach to external on the one hand and internal violence on the other. Ettore? And then I have no one else on, I see no one else, no other yellow hands. So we will move on to the third question after that. Ettore.
Thank you very much, Nadia. I do agree with the other colleagues. I think that these 2 points need to be very well distinguished and separated. It's very hard to gather them into just one issue. These are 2 different topics and that must be dealt with the utmost attention. And of course, there are commonalities between the 2 points, even in our sector. Of course, as I said before, there is a sort of interaction between external and internal harassment or violence. So, having said so, I do agree with my colleagues and with what they've said before. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ettore. It's good also to spell out when we agree with something, because sometimes we take silence for consent, which shouldn't be the case. So great to really express also your agreement. So point taken. And Lara?
Yes, I also think we should make a distinction, especially in terms of violence. External violence can be occasional, while internal violence and harassment is something which is perpetrated on a daily basis. It can be it can be continuous and a daily violence. Therefore, we need very specific actions with two different set of actions. Once again, I state the importance of making a distinction between the two kind of violence. We should really highlight this item. So this distinction is very relevant. Thank you for giving me the floor.
Thanks, Lara. So are there any other comments for that second question? No. And just to check with Marcella, if everything is clear for the report, it seems the consensus kind of emerges to keep obviously a separate approach to external violence, which I think the point was also to say, well, look, it seems that at the national level, that's not always, obviously the response is different for external violence, but in terms of policy documents, collective agreements, it doesn't seem to be split, but it seems that that was our first impression, but there is consensus to keep to keep external violence as a standalone issue to tackle. Well,
yeah,
Marcella, if you have any,
yeah,
questions?
maybe Nadia. Yeah, this is what indeed I took note of, and it might sound also obvious, but I was thinking while you were all speaking that maybe this is also one point where we will reach a kind of a consensus with the employer, so we have more chances that they all also agree that keeping the two types of violence, tackling them separately, we would probably reach more consensus on the third-party violence aspect, and have less divergences when we tackle the internal violence issue. So this was what I was thinking.
Yeah, that's true. Thanks. I'm going to screen share again to have a look at the third question, which is about what's happening at the national level. And again, if I'm sure you remember what Jane just said this morning. So again, we find that the implementation in terms of implementing the guidelines as a multisectoral agreement or policy guidelines also at national level has been very poor. But basically, we have very few examples where we can say the European guidelines have been translated like that, have been implemented like that in X and Y country. And the language issue cannot be a reason, because they were available in 18, 19 languages. So we're trying to find out exactly why. And again, the guidelines have and continue apparently to be inspiring at the national level, and as we heard, outside Europe also, and at the ILO level when the ILO Convention 190 had been negotiated. But is there something we can change in terms of the legal status of the guidelines to ensure that they would have a more positive impact at the national level? In other words, and we might as well call a spade, could the guidelines become binding, or could they provide inspiration for binding instruments, so that there is a kind of, as we like it, to have a more of a coherent effective implementation at the national level. So initially, well, since we are just with the trade union reps today, just now, initially with Paola and Adam, we thought, well, could the guidelines, what does it mean, guidelines? So we thought, well, could the guidelines become an agreement and therefore be much more binding? And then based on the research, well, because there are very few examples of collective agreements dealing with third-party violence, because usually that's integrated, again, as it was said, into health and safety or gender equality or indeed digitalization, we thought, well, perhaps that would be the wrong track to try and turn the guidelines into an agreement. So we thought, well, perhaps the sort of impetus, obligation that there is a policy framework or a collective agreement at the workplace dealing with external violence would already be an achievement. So it's not that we would change, so it's not that the guidelines would have to be literally transposed into a national document, but that the guidelines providing for a policy at the workplace should be picked up, taken up by social partners at the national level in their collective agreements. Could be one way. And we thought then also, but what about the multisectoral approach? Because we can see the commonalities, but in the responses to the survey, there is a demand for more sectoral specific guidance. And there is obviously a limit to how much specific you can be in a multisectoral document. Otherwise, it will be 40 pages long, and there will be little interest in doing that. So we thought one route, which is complementary to what I've just said, would be for each of the sectors involved in the project, so education, local and regional government, central government, transport, etc., to do their own sectoral agreement, possibly, or their own guidelines. And would that make more sense to have a sectoral, so we have that discussion on a multi-sectoral level, which is fruitful and enrich every sector, but deep down the work will have to be made by each of the sectors involved. So there are different ideas that we, obviously we've put on the table. Today is not decision time, it's just to have your views. First, do you think the status, that the lack of national implementation of the guidelines has got something to do with the fact that there are guidelines and therefore they're not legally binding? And if so, do you think it's a problem? As many trade union responses have indicated as part of the survey, and if so, how can we improve that? Manuela.
Maybe this is the most important question because it refers to the implementation stage. Based upon my experience, I may say that in Italy there was an agreement on the 25th of January 2017. With this agreement, these guidelines were implemented, and both parties, employers and trade unions, decided to implement them on the workplaces. Such guidelines concern all the production sectors, and then after this general basis, each sectoral confederation, if so they wished, they better defined the sectoral agreements. I read the intersectoral agreement and it was a very useful tool. So basically in Italy with this agreement, we had a precious document. Many documents were drafted at company, but also at sectoral levels. And in these documents, first of all, we had some clear definitions. So the terms of violence and harassment were clearly defined. And in those documents, we could find a conclusion. In such a conclusion, we could read that both social partners were engaged and were active so that this problem could be tackled at the workplace. And then there were different levels of intervention, because in some places some one-stop shops were opened. There were services addressed to the internal staff. Somewhere else, some external offices were opened. So in many sectors, there were activities, but in other sectors, this document was not implemented. Therefore, this document was not useful in some sectors. Sometimes it was not even well known. People didn't know the presence of this confederal agreement made by both social partners. And as for the future, I think this is the real problem we have to tackle. How can we make possible that the new guidelines defined at a European level can be concretely translated in Italy, but also in all the other countries of the EU? Of course, we can impose it through means of legislation, so with some community rules. So it should be imposed from above, and all single countries should have to implement it before a certain deadline. But maybe this is not really the solution, because at the end of it, a social consultation is of a paramount importance. So the documents which were signed in Italy in 2016 had an important value, because this was an important signal. Social partner said stop to violence, but as I was saying it at the beginning, that the most difficult part is the implementation part. So we should insist on the implementation, how to avoid such problems on the workplace. So at the end, violence and harassment were introduced into this into the paragraph of security and health on the workplace. But at the end, according to me, this approach was still too much general. And the different documents which were put on the walls at the workplace were important communication. The workers read it. Violence and harassment were clearly defined, and we could read everywhere how to try and avoid such problems. But here, it is not enough. So the communication is not enough. The training part is equally important. On both sides, there is a need of awareness. Everybody has to be aware of such problems. So we need to reflect upon the implementation. We need a really specific approach to the implementation stage, because formally it is very easy to pronounce well aspirations, but at the end, I think, as I was saying at the beginning of my intervention, in some sectors, people were not even aware of such intersectoral documents. This is an important indication, because it reflects a negative trend, and it hampers the implementation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as Jane told us, there seems to be more, as part of the responses to the survey, there is more awareness on the guidelines from the employers than from the trade union side. But having said that, there were more trade union responses wanting a legally binding tool rather than a soft, sort of very soft actually, guidelines. But it's interesting. It would be interesting to know, Manuela, but perhaps we can get more details in writing, why the guidelines were turned into an agreement in one sector, but not in other sectors, whether because social partners in that sector were more proactive, or that, you know, but we can perhaps come back to that at a later stage. Are there anyone else who would like to comment on what should the guidelines remain as guidelines, or should they be turned into something, or having mechanism, inbuilt mechanism that would make their implementation more straightforward, more automatic, and therefore we can actually report back? And there are some very basic, again, things in the guidelines, such as the importance of reporting every time there is one incident of violence, not to leave it untackled. And data, I mean, I know that in some sectors that there's not even sort of coherent data collection of abuse and keeping a record of it. For instance, having shared official data also on violence can actually be missing in a number of sectors. So trade unions have to collect their own data to, you know, to demonstrate that there is an issue at play. Ettore.
Exactly, you anticipated me. That's I wanted to say. I think that in Italy we lack an awareness from the workers. So we should need maybe in Italy an awareness campaign on this topic. Because information is paramount. If people are not aware of the problems, it is impossible to intervene. Sometimes the victims of the abuses didn't even report such acts. So information at this level also, because workers are unaware of the possibilities to act. And this is important not just in the education sector, but in different sectors. So I would really highlight this aspect, the fact of having information and awareness raising campaigns. The interpreters apologize, but the sound from Hector is not very good. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, absolutely. That remains key. Michael and then Sabine. Welcome, Sabine.
Thank you. I don't have a very clear opinion on this matter, but I would like to ask a question to the rest of you, because I'm interested to hear of your experiences. The way I see it is that to one extent, we already have binding regulations in place. The guidelines are built upon the OSH directive from 1989. So we do already to some extent have the binding regulations about risk assessment and mitigation and education, all that. So the way I see it, the main problem is at the national level. And do you think in your own countries that it would make a difference at national level if this instrument is an agreement instead of guidelines? I mean, it would to some extent create more obligations, but they are still formally non-binding. So I'm just curious to hear your experiences. Thank you.
Very good question. I mean, and just to remind, there are two types of agreements. One, indeed, which it's not legally binding as such, and insofar as social partners implement it, but you cannot go to the court to challenge, misgivings or non-compliance. And then there is a second type of agreement, which would then mean it would have to be we would ask the Commission to transpose the agreement into a directive, which would then have to be adopted in Council. So it's a long process. And yeah, I don't know. It's maybe, I'm not sure that would be the best appropriate route for the topic, but are there any quick answers to Michael's questions? What difference would it make if the guidelines had legal weight in your country? And when you think about it, Sabine, you may take the floor. Thank you.
Yes, good morning, everybody. In fact, I'm not able to answer that question because I'm working at European level. But I think we should be, as European social partners, more ambitious and go for an autonomous agreement. I believe as well that an agreement implemented by directive would be too difficult, and also probably because of the different sectoral situations, it would not be possible. But an autonomous agreement where we have really at European level a kind of frame that really sets down the major principles, and then I'm brainstorming. It could be a kind of annex where we go more into detail. It would give a little bit more obligation than guidelines. It's an agreement. When social partners commit the agreement, sign the agreement, they commit much more to implement it than when they sign guidelines. And there is a stronger reporting obligation towards the European Commission, and the European Commission has also a stronger obligation to monitor the implementation of such an agreement. That's why we call it also as a binding agreement, even when it is not binding in the legal sense, but it is binding for the social partners who sign it, and binding for the Commission to monitor the implementation more seriously. So I think we should try to go for it as trade unions, and we will see how the employers would act to it.
Thanks, Sabine. Did you have sufficient time to get back to Michael? Or we can also do that in writing at a later stage, but it would be I think we have another 5 minutes, because the following question really relates to this one in terms of the legal weight of any revision to the guidelines. But any thoughts? What difference would it make? Do you think it would make a difference if the guidelines had more legal weight? So it could be a blunt yes or no. Ooh, scary online. I mean, again, a majority of trade unionists who responded to the survey said they would want the guidelines to have more legal bindness. But then it's true that we need to clarify what the possibilities are at EU level, although many of you would be aware of those different options. Manuela, prego.
Yes, I think that this could help, as in all activities, the priority, the focus would be on training and on the awareness. It is important to act because people believe that such actions are relevant, but it's also important the binding elements, because I was thinking of all the sectors and of all the realities where the problems was not taken into consideration, not at all, in such frameworks, in such environments. Having a more binding element could really help. Of course, we hope that such practice should be shared. We would prefer a voluntary approach. It would be much better if the stakeholders would do it on a voluntary basis. But yes, I think that the binding element would really help. Thank you.
Thanks, Manuela. And yeah, it's interesting also the comments on the risk assessment Michael did. Yeah, after all, there is a legal provision on conducting health risk assessments as part of the 1989 directive on health and safety. But I know that the sector I'm dealing with, central governments, which should lead by a model, by example, and very few administrations, at least as of whenever it was 4 years ago, would conduct health risk assessment on a regular basis in consultation of trade union reps. So even fewer would actually address psychosocial risk in the risk assessment. So it leaves like very, very few dealing with violence as part of the health risk assessment. Yet this is an obligation. So how do we make that obligation really, alive and kicking? Because that's a key prevention tool, and yet it doesn't seem to be used as much as it should, really. So let's think of how this could be better implemented. Utente, if you can introduce yourself, because I'm not sure even if Utente is your first name. Sorry, or your son.
I do apologize. This is my first participation. My name is Pecoraro Gianfranco, CGIL. I'm part of a national coordination office. I've followed with great interest your intervention, and I think that also your inquiries are very interesting. They open my reflection to a fantastic world. I'm really enthusiastic. My agreement is related to a legislation. My work agreement is related to the prison sector. So my contract is implemented through a legislation. As a CGIL, as the Italian trade union, we were very engaged on this topic. And we must say that we are really exposed to violence in our sector. Such aspects should be part of a national decree, because it would seem that we work in a military environment, even though it is not really a military sector. So it is important to have such a regulation well defined in a national decree. At national level, we really find a few lines concerning the problems of violence. As CGIL, I collaborate with the University of the City of Parma, and I think that we really need a clear indications to such problems. So apart from indicating the problems, the Italian constitution makes a reference to it, but we need more binding rules, especially in the police sector, because in the police sector, we have work contracts which are related to the national degree, though quite general. But in Italy, I would like to precise that we also have military corpses in the police where such provisions are not indicated. And sorry for my long intervention.
Yeah, no, very interesting. And that's another one to tackle in terms of, yeah, the military status and expectations, and also of violence, tolerance for violence is also extremely important in that debate. I mean, how much you tolerate, you put up, you think it's normal, violence is normal, when certainly it is not. Michael, I think you'll be the last one before we break for a coffee break.
Thanks, I'll be quick. I was planning to make a short comment in the chat, but then I realized that the employers might read it when they come back to the room. What I was going to say was just that if the problem is that the regulations that we already have are not being followed, then maybe we should consider finding some strategic cases and countries to the report to the Commission for not having transposed and implemented the directive fully.
Yeah.
That's my only comment. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that would be certainly an important route, because it's a recurrent thing. I mean, the lack of proper implementation of the health and safety directive is certainly, yeah, a running thing. Are there any other burning questions? Marcella, will you be okay for the report, or do you need further clarification? I think, again, today is not decision time. It's to feed into our, thinking, our brain, and then, but the outcomes of the project clearly should feed into future decision, i.e. there will be recommendations. So what you're saying is certainly, we'll take it into account, but we're not deciding yet which way or another we are going. But at the end of the project, we should have clear guidance on where it is we want to go. So, and in time for the conference on the 25th of November. So the path should be clearer, at least in the next couple of months. Marcella, are you all right? And well, we can expand and complement.
I think for this last question, Nadia, I would simply say that we believe that something more binding would be preferable, but we can still discuss about it and see what also the employers, to which conclusion or to which recommendation they come. I don't know if in a first stage it would be helpful to say that doing more communication, as some of you said, and training and raising more awareness about the guidelines would help further. Also, thanks to the fact that 12 years later we can more communicate on some topics through campaigns, through social media. So we have this advantage on our side more than 12 years ago, but at the same time, I have the impression that, in certain sectors or for some topics, if something is not really binding, there is also a lack of awareness. If something is binding, then you have to communicate more on this issue, so it might go together. So I don't know. I will simply say that we had a discussion and that we think that probably a more binding tool would be more helpful, also in raising awareness about the issue. Yeah. But then, as you said, we can also say that each sector can then, each committee, social dialogue committee, can then decide how to further develop.
No, absolutely. The real decision takers will be obviously the sectoral social dialogue committees, but we can provide guidance. And as it was mentioned, there are different types. There are two different types of agreements at EU level. This so-called autonomous agreement, as there is on digitalization, telework, harassment and violence of 2006 or 2007. So there are agreements, but you cannot go to the court basically if in case of non-compliance. But there is much more legal legal impact than the guidelines would have, or there is another type of agreement which would require the transformation into a directive. And here it's certainly, then it's the most binding way of the tools available to EU social partners. Okay, but I think that will be fine as a conclusion. And again, to complement also the responses to the survey, which in that case are a bit more clear-cut between the trade union and the employer side in wanting something more legally binding. But let's see how we're going to deal with that. I'd like to thank you a lot. It has been extremely fruitful. Thanks a lot for your comments and questions. It's very good when there's a question as an answer to another questions. I mean, at least that's, things are moving. So we will be back in plenary at 12:15 for a short report. And then you will also have a report of the discussions as we always do for this project. And you will be kept posted then on the next steps leading on to the conference in November. Thanks a lot and have a nice break. See you in 7 minutes now, 10 minutes. Thank you. Bye-bye. Right, welcome back to the plenary session. Do we have Gregory or Gador with us from the employers group, just to check that you had, well, that you're back to plenary? Yeah. Great, brilliant. Well, so this session will run until 1 o'clock. So we have 40 minutes to go. If we finish earlier, that's fine too. And just also to underline really that, well, this is called the brainstorm. So this is not decision time, but we do need, as part of the steering group members, orientations, guidelines on what it is we're going to do and how we're going to do it. So based on today's discussion, but also obviously based on the previous, well, 5 webinars, topic-based webinars, and the responses to the survey, which Jane gave a few glimpses earlier today regarding the implementation of the guidelines. So I hope you had a good discussion, that it has been useful. I must say from the trade union group that it was extremely, I think it was quite, extremely fruitful. Because it was interactive and it's nice. I know that we're all facing a Zoom fatigue, and the Zoom is great to inform. It's not so great to exchange views, and especially, and we fully understand and appreciate that regarding important questions as you had to do today on the legal status of the guidelines. So it's just to relax from that end, but at the same time, express views, and really how basically, again, the key question for whatever we do in Brussels has to have meaning, bearing at the national level, at the workplace, for employees, workers, for managers. So it has to be meaningful, and especially more today after 2 years of the pandemic and lockdown. I think everybody is in quest of meaning and being useful. So that's basically what we try to do, collect a few ideas, and then we will come back to you. Of course, there will be a report of that discussion today, and then further documents in writing then to clarify the framework as to how we want to tackle the next steps. And in terms of decisions, to really underline that the decisions will lie with each of the sectoral social dialogue committee involved in the project. So that said, who would like to start? That it's up to you, Marcella ou bien Jamie. Should I take an alphabetical order? So Jamie, you'll be the first one, if that's okay with you. Thank you.
Contribute. So it was, yes, good and interactive as the other group. So on the first question, which is about whether or not the guidelines should be updated and also should it be expanded, the main conclusions of our exchange was that there was a general consensus on the need to update the guidelines, in particular the language and the terms used, and also to take into account new themes such as digitalization and cyber and online violence. Also working from home, the home becoming more of a work environment than before. It sounds like the group is okay to make reference to gender-based violence and other terms that may be in the draft directive for the European Union, but to be extremely careful to not explicitly reference the draft directive because it's currently in a draft form. It's seen as being too risky. We explored the potential alignment of terms with ILO 190 and UNCRPD. And what we came up with as a kind of compromise idea is we could write that employers are strongly in support of updating the guidelines in the spirit of no violence, and to share good practices facilitating the principles and measures in Convention ILO 190. And for potential expansion of the guidelines, it was unanimous that the organizations in the discussion don't have the mandate currently to go down that path. So that was the first question. How would you like to go? Do you want to do each side shares the first question, or should I go through all 4 questions?
I think that sounds like a good plan to actually now take the first question from the trade union side. So excellent idea, and I can go along with that if Marcella is okay.
Yes, yes, of course. Thank you, Nadia. Thank you, Jamie. So also in our group, I would say that we also had a very strong yes. So a broad consensus on the necessity of refreshing and updating the guidelines, which is actually also taken from the survey findings that go in this direction. And so in the discussion, it was clear that we go towards a yes, also because we, all the members, we identified of new risks and new drivers of violence, which are also consequence of the pandemic. So we saw that some factors that were already there before the pandemic, like understaffing, especially in some sectors, like in the healthcare sector, they have been exacerbated by the pandemic. So of course we need to underline this in an update of the guidelines. So we identified this understaffing issues, very important, a kind of mental and social distress that in some more vulnerable groups like women, youth, and other users that really are also a new driver of violence. And then this general frustration of users and citizens also due to to the pandemic, and also due to this to some public services that are online, and then there is no more contact with some services, which on the one hand can lead to less physical violence, but more cyber violence, cyber baiting. So we agree, I think, on this point with the employers, saying that indeed we need to take into consideration also new types of a new type of context with more cyber violence. And so I think that was in a we had a lot of exchanges on this point, but I think that's a more or less summary of the first question.
Excellent. Can I ask maybe the group if you have additional comments to Marcella and Jamie before we move on to the second question, or for clarification? No, doesn't seem to be the case. What I was wondering, Jamie, is, and indeed you did mention telework, were there any new issues which were not mentioned in the discussion document or the questions as part of a possible update to the guidelines? You mentioned gender-based violence, including also domestic violence, and that some of the provisions, I mean, with care, but some of the provisions of the ILO 190, and looking perhaps at the overall context of the draft directive on gender-based violence, but obviously with caution, because that's still a draft and not adopted. But just to give perhaps ideas, you mentioned digitalization, which was part of the question, certainly, and then the new context of teleworking following the pandemic, which is likely indeed to stay with us. Were there any other issues that we would not have at all mentioned for the past Yeah, also no. Okay.
No, I think
And
it was going in the same direction, same flow.
okay, so we can say that in terms of identifying key issues, we are on the right track, it seems. Okay. All right. Well, the second question then, which is splitting external violence and internal violence, is it still meaningful? And again, the background for asking this question is twofold. One is indeed that cyber violence, based on the ILO study, which was presented to us a couple of months ago, it seemed that cyber violence is more something coming from, it's more internal violence. It's coming more often from colleagues or management. Whereas when we talk about violence and excluding cyber violence, based on the research that fed into the guidelines, so going back to 10 years ago, and then further sectoral work, there was more incidence of occurrence of external violence than internal violence. Now, is cyber violence changing that? And then does it make sense to split external violence from internal violence? And the second reason is the cross-sectoral agreement on violence and harassment of 2006 or 2007, which mentions external violence, but leaving it to social partners to deal with it or not. And this is where we got into play and drafted those multisectoral guidelines specifically on external violence, because we thought at the time they were not sufficiently dealt with in the cross-sectoral agreement. Now, for the time being, as far as I know, the cross-sectoral agreement on violence and harassment is not yet up for revision. It might well be the case. That's obviously a decision for the cross-sectoral social partners to take. But interestingly, the cross-sectoral social partners have agreed to revise the telework agreement. So it's also, I'm mentioning it because obviously we work closely with the cross-sectoral social partners, and there may be also, paths in between that we can think of in terms of possible revisions to the guidelines. But anyway, stop talking here, Jamie, and for that second question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nadia. So here, to this question, the group agreed that they would like to maintain a distinction between internal versus external violence and harassment, that it makes sense logically and practically, and there was a reference to the cross-sectoral agreement of 2007, saying that if we decide to integrate more the internal and external violence, it would actually require revision of the 2007 agreement. So yes, there was also mentioned that the prevention and kind of reporting protocols and measures are very different for the two types of violence. And with a little intervention from Jane, who was explaining a little bit about a broader context where there's maybe more of a movement towards integrated definitions, as we see in the ILO Convention 190, but it doesn't make sense to integrate the actions. Those need to remain distinct. There was an idea shared to maybe enrich or rephrase Article 5, but to not change the meaning of the original text, and also to encourage, as a good practice, perhaps having a single interface in an organization for reporting issues with violence. So even if the follow-up is done in different processes and different strands, to reduce confusion amongst employees, to not make them feel frustrated or not heard, that idea was proposed to have a single face for violence, even if it takes different paths. On the Article 5, I'm not sure if our colleagues from HOSPIM want to elaborate a bit more, because I didn't get all of the notes. But it was definitely in the sense that, yes, third-party violence merits a distinctive approach. Leonie or Sarah, if you want to complement?
Yes, it was more as a general. Oh, sorry, you want to go? Okay. More as a general question. Article 5 in the introductions of the guidelines read as if there's a distinction as such. And if this is a distinction basically when it comes to external internal, or if this is just about explaining that third party violence is different to other types of violence. So this was more like an open question to the discussion.
I've just screen share the article 5 you're talking about. We are on the same page here. That's this article, article 5 you have on your screen.
Precisely.
The issue of third-party violence is sufficiently distinct from the question of violence and harassment among colleagues and from management. We seem to have forgotten that one in the guidelines in the workplace, and sufficiently significant in terms of its impact on the health and safety of workers and its economic impact to warrant a distinctive approach. Well, I leave it to Marcella to do the report, but the questions you raised, yeah, I think we were also wondering a bit. So yeah, I leave it to Marcella first to do the report, and then we can come back to the discussion. So thanks a lot, Jamie.
Yes, thank you, Nadia. Yes, indeed, I also on these questions, our reply is yes, and I think we have some common. We had some common thoughts to like the employers. We discussed the issue of the two types of violence, saying that there are, although the commonalities of the types of violence and so on, we should keep the perspective separate, also because the conditions of violence and solutions are often different, and indeed also like in the other group, there was the idea of having a single document, a single recommendation, but with some specificities to keep the pictures and responses to the two types of violence distinctive. What was, I think, very, very meaningful was, I think, your idea, Nadia, to say that we should maybe put in this document a kind of recommendation on how to create in general a context of non-violence, and then keep the two types of violence distinct.
Thanks, Marcella. Jamie, you want to ask a question before I ask other members of the group? Oh, yeah, no, that was a thumb up. So, yeah, okay. I'm getting there after 2 years. Are there any additional complementary remarks to those very concise reports and clear and concise reports regarding the first two questions? No. So we can move on to the third question, which is on the implementation. What's going on? How come the implementation has not been perhaps as great as we would have liked it to be, but at the same time, not to take also only a formal approach, which is, oh, well, indeed, the guidelines were formally speaking implemented in a couple of countries as a collective agreement. Denmark, and in fact, earlier on, we also heard from Italy did implement the guidelines in a collective agreement in one sector. We have no examples whatsoever of multisectoral agreements. But so that would be a formal approach, but it's at the same time, as Jane said, the guidelines have had and continue to have influence. Sorry, I see Adam, you're waving. Okay, I've had influence also outside Europe at the ILO and at the ILO level. So that there is still this kind of inspiration which the guidelines are providing. So it doesn't mean the guidelines were not useful, but in terms of having a continuum of implementation and something coherent across the EU 27 member states, and to have that building of minimum social standards shared across the European Union. Well, here we have a problem. So how do we overcome that problem? Any ideas regarding that third and fourth question, which can be tackled together actually, unless you needed perhaps more explanation on why we came up with the fourth question? And yeah, okay, was clear, great. Jamie, okay.
Okay, so in discussion of questions 3 and 4, everyone agreed that we need much more awareness raising on the guidelines, especially via accessible and visual materials, something a bit more visual and attractive than the current format, maybe even envisioning communication toolkits. There's also a suggestion to promote the guidelines in different levels of reporting. So first in internal reporting for an organization, then also at national level. The example of Spain was given, where there's every 2 years a report on incidents of third-party violence. And so that's collected and then sent to every department in Spain. Also, it was noted that the third-party guidelines, when there's good practices featured in EU reports, that gives a high level of visibility. So being able to get a good practice or example into EU reports is a good idea. But really the conversation revolved a lot around communication and dissemination as an objective for the guidelines also themselves. And maybe there could be a creation of fact sheets in different languages. That was suggested, maybe to use any extra project resources to go towards that, or multi-language toolkit for communication and dissemination with maybe images and text that can be repurposed by those who are implementing. There was also an idea of simplification of the guidelines by including a few key principles that summarize the essence of the guidelines, which support internal processes. So the idea behind that suggestion was that it could simplify adoption, implementation, and communication of the guidelines if an organization can talk about the general principles that they're pursuing with that. Yeah, in terms of inspiration for binding instruments, well, the group doesn't have a mandate really to go in any direction on anything binding. I can share that. And the fourth question, we discussed this a little bit less in detail because we went quite far in number 3. Again, we said it's an issue of for collective agreements. It's an issue of communication and disseminating the guidelines to policymakers, and using resources in different languages to raise awareness and create a low threshold for engagement. So that is, for example, when there is a successful adoption of a text into a collective agreement, to make that available in other languages so it can just be kind of taken up with less effort, let's say. I hope I got that right. So anybody who was in the group, please feel free to correct me or make additions as necessary.
Is it the case? No yellow hands. And on the I do have a question on the principles, because it's true that we had a steering group when we discussed, but perhaps that the term guidelines is also a bit, unclear as such as what it means, and without going, at least not yet, depending on the outcome of the discussion, then again to be taken up in the sectoral social dialogue committees, but whether the term principles would actually be better than guidelines and stronger, and then in turn the principles could be, or that there could be some kind of mechanism so that the principles would be reflected in various ways, in fact, in different EU sectoral agreements and or national collective agreements, but that those principles, the guidelines, at the same time, given the amount of work and thinking and the the urgency of the problem in some cases, and the fact that it seems to be growing, would require something stronger in terms of also in terms of communicating, because that's communicating on guidelines. I mean, I agree that better communication would do no harm, but it's when you already have an unidentified or insufficiently identified tool, it's much more difficult to communicate. It's not like we can say, well, this is the agreement, that's what we agreed. Now it's for the national social partners. I mean, we can provide this and that. Say, well, oh yeah, okay, guidelines, but what are they? And then there is a whole discussion on the name of the tool instead of, you know, just implementing what it is inside the tool. So we tend to think that we do have an issue here just with the term guidelines, but okay, it remains, we can discuss it further. And I'm tempted to ask, if you don't have any mandates for today, when do you think you would have a mandate? Would you? I'm pulling a bit your, don't want to be pulling your leg, Jamie, but it's just the issue of mandates, because I mean, again, the decision that will be for the sectoral social dialogue committees, but in terms of expressing views, and it seems that we do have an issue in terms of implementing the guidelines at national level. But do you think, based obviously on written documents which will go to the steering group, that a mandate can be firmed up a bit in terms of orientations for the 25th of November?
Definitely. And 25th of November, yeah, there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to. I just have to admit, I was expecting to see perhaps some of our members here in the webinar to participate directly and share their perspective from the ground. But yeah, for today, it's a bit complicated, but by 25th of November, and based on written documents, which we do tend to have a more broad representation of the views of our membership when we consult them in a written format. It's a bit more accessible, also with language issues. So I make that commitment for CMR for the final conference.
Okay, great.
Get a mandate.
Thanks. So that certainly will be done on that basis. Okay, now the trade union group, Marcella, thank you.
Yes, so I think that at the beginning, the discussion went more or less in the same direction as the employer, saying that indeed there is an issue, of course, with communication on the guidelines. Some members insisted on the paramount importance of social consultation, of training on topics of third-party violence, so to raise more awareness. But then there is indeed this the more difficult part is the implementation part. So next to the fact that we, 12 years later, we could of course take advantage of insisting in more communication, in taking advantage of social media to indeed have also some more, more visual tools, as also Jamie said, that we communicate maybe with some more synthetic documents, but more that they are more striking in terms of on social media and so on. Next to this, we as trade union, we said that we also need to insist more on the that the binding element is also very important. So we said that there are different type of agreements, so we can still discuss, of course, throughout the project, and then, as Nadia said, within each sectoral social dialogue committee, but that the binding element of an updated document, of updated guidelines or principle is also important. So on the one hand, of course, we have to communicate and raise more awareness on this topic and on a new document. We could use, of course, as you said, also, fact sheet. Let's see if we have some resources to make this document more readable, more to communicate better on that. But on the other hand, the voluntary basis would be preferable, but we have, I think we thought that we need more binding rules. I think that was more or less the summary. But Nadia, if you want to add some more elements, or if the other members want to add more on this binding issue, please go ahead.
Is there anyone else from the trade union group who would like to complement Marcella's excellent report? No, 1, 2, 3. There was just one thing that was mentioned during, well, two things actually. So obviously, what do we mean by, more binding, more legally binding? And to remind, and again, that's now also because of the kind of blurring social dialogue tools that we certainly need to clean up at some point. But there are two types of agreements, so that everybody knows that. There is the so-called autonomous agreements. So that could be, for instance, the agreement on harassment and violence, or telework, or digitalization at cross-sectoral level, which was adopted last year. And here, the autonomous agreements are not legally binding in that, in case of non-compliance, an employee or a trade union rep could not, or it would be very difficult to go to the European Court of Justice, basically to challenge issues of non-compliance. But it's still binding insofar as social partners make it binding. And clearly, when you strike an autonomous agreement, well, there is this commitment to see it implemented at the workplace level. And there is also, although it's still a bit, it's maybe weak, a role for the Commission to also contribute to reporting, monitoring the implementation of the agreement. That so-called autonomous agreement, unfortunately called autonomous, which doesn't, anything we do as social partners is in respect of the full autonomy principle. So it's a bit, doesn't make much sense to call it autonomous agreements, but that's how it's been called. And then there is a second type of agreements, which then requires from the Commission transformation of the agreement into a directive, which then has to be adopted in Council for decision. And then it's strictly speaking legally binding, that you basically can go to the court. So we do have 12, 13, 14 agreements, cross-sectoral and sectoral agreements, which have been turned into directives, social directives, and therefore contributing to this social playing field, which we are certainly very attached to as social partners. So regarding the guidelines, I think it needs to be clear. There are options, two types of agreements, and then the option also of maybe changing them to principles, let's see, to have more binding effect. But when we talk about legally binding, it's basically one type of agreement, so to speak. The second one, when it becomes a directive. Now, whether that would be appropriate, whether the trade union side and the employers would want to go along that route, it certainly requires much more discussion. But I think it's very important to know what all the options are. We need to have an informed discussion based on that. My second point, I forgot. Oh, yes. Risk assessments, because that's clearly, we had a webinar focusing on risk assessments. And risk assessment, that's actually a legal provision from the 1989 Directive on Health and Safety. So even though the guidelines are not legally binding, well, there are provisions which stem from legislation, not least the one on risk assessment, and a ban on violence is part of any kind of sound legal framework, rule of law in a state. So that's also how do we connect? Maybe there is a space in between. In fact, I think that was the point made by some trade union colleagues this morning. I think a mix, and the guidelines are a dynamic tool, and that's perhaps will take more creativity from our side on how we can improve the implementation based on that. but at the same time, keeping it simple and clear. Otherwise, it's the best recipe for disaster and for a bad implementation. But it's just to keep in mind that we do have already, in fact, legal provisions in the guidelines. Anyway, I will stop here. Are there any complementary remarks? Any questions on how we're going to go next? And or Jane, would you like to add something to that very good reporting exercise? And I think it was certainly worth having that trade union separate discussion and employer separate discussion, as we would in a normal context in person in any case. But I'm glad it seems to have been working even online. So, Jane, I don't know if you
I don't have any other points to add, except to say I think they've been really, really fruitful discussions. And I'm thinking from the very beginning of the project, when we had the first webinar, how we've moved on in the way we describe the guidelines, the issues. I mean, the new language of the guidelines has come into our discourse, actually, in the discussions that I heard in both the employers and the union groups. So I think we're already at a stage where we're recognizing the importance of the updating and new definitions and new contexts that we're working in. So I think it gives a very solid background actually for the next stage. So thanks very much, everybody. It's been a really interesting discussion today.
Great, yeah, thanks, Jane. And so the next steps now, there will be a report of today's brainstorm in the next couple of weeks or so. We will certainly have another steering group, extended steering group meeting to prepare the conference, the agenda on the 25th of November. I haven't yet fixed a date, so bear with me and hope to be to give you longer notice than previously. It may be that June will be a bit complicated to have that meeting, but certainly in the first 2 weeks of September, then at the latest, when we're back from the summer. The conference on the 25th of November hopefully will be in Madrid. I don't know if Gador, you confirm? Yes, see?
Yes, I confirm.
Estupendo, it's great. So, and I'm very happy because it's also a very symbolic venue at the National Health and Safety Agency of Spain. And then it's in Madrid. So, you know, don't have to add on to that. It will be excellent to see each other in Madrid. In terms of the budget, and I took your point on communication and whether there is any budget left to do something a bit more lively. I will look into that. While I think, and certainly there would be money left because we haven't had any in-person meetings. So some money was a bit spent because online and interpretation obviously do have a price. But I think what we could do on the 25th of November is possibly to arrive on the 24th to have also a social, well, you know, just a dinner, obviously, but to have a bit more informal time to network and get to know each other for those who don't. So to get more quality time around the conference in Madrid. And before that, well, we'll certainly amend a discussion document regarding the revision of the guidelines that will be discussed in the steering group. So to provide more flesh on the bone regarding what it is we can try and do, which will then be subject to another discussion at the conference and will feed into the final policy recommendations. So by the end of the draft policy recommendations will be presented already at the conference and then finalized for the end of the year. And then let's see what the different sectoral social dialogue committees will want to do or not to do. But that will be for later. Right, I'd like to thank the interpreters, like magnificent as usual. Thanks a lot for your time and the quality of interpretation. Thanks to Munia, who is my colleague who helped organize, well, Paola's and Adam's also colleague who helped organize today's online and possibly final online meeting. And I really look forward to seeing you in flesh. Even for the steering meeting, actually, I hope we can do it in person because we are all based in Brussels except Jane. So hopefully we can find a date and then have lunch and just see each other. Thanks a lot for your very useful contributions today. And a safe journey back home, safe journey anyway to the desk work, and yeah, see you soon. Bye-bye.